yesterday from the Iranian ambassador to Russia. He says that Russia has proposed a defense pact between between like-minded countries against NATO, and the proposals are still in the early negotiations phase. And when you look at the way that Iran and Russia somehow are, changing their mindset toward what's going on in the case of NATO, and how NATO, because the attack on Iran, we have to accept the attack on Iran was not just Israeli attack on Iran. It was the whole West supporting Israel in that attack. The intelligence, the way that, even during the war, when they attacked Iran, they tried to condemn Iran instead of condemning Israel. That was amazing to watch. And the European leaders saying that this is Israel is doing our daily job against Iran. What is, in your opinion, that is shaping, something is shaping between Iran and Russia, or maybe other countries coming? What is your take on that?
Yes, as you rightly point out, it wasn't just the Israeli regime. It was obviously the United States. Trump accepted responsibility, even though earlier on the National Security Advisor and Secretary of State Rubio denied U.S. involvement. Trump said the United States that he was the person behind the war. So this was an operation carried out by NATO. And when I mean NATO, I mean that includes Turkey, because their facilities, unfortunately, were being used. Their airspace was used by the United States. Their radar installations were used. The Republic of Azerbaijan was deeply involved. Northern Iraq was involved, even though the central government was opposed to it. But the United States was using its assets in the north of that country, and the Israeli regime, along with their allies, were working against Iran from there. Syrian territory, I don't know if the Syrian regime uh, was linked to it, but Syrian territory was used, and I don't mean just the airspace, but the Persian Gulf monarchs, all of them, the radar installations, the U.S. bases there, they were all used. So this was a huge coalition. And I would not be surprised if the Iranians and the Russians and others began to work more closely with one another with regards to a structural military relationship. I don't know if one could ultimately call it an alliance or not, but I think it is important that in these very dangerous times, the global majority has the ability to defend itself, because the Americans are behaving increasingly uh, provocative in a provocative manner, whether it's in Venezuela, whether it's in when they speak of Nigeria. We saw the United States refuse to attend the G20 in South Africa, claiming that there's a genocide going on there against the white minority. And so every day now in Gaza, in Lebanon, in the West Bank, the Israeli regime with Western support is slaughtering people. No punishment, no condemnation from the EU, European and American human rights organizations. They're all quiet. It doesn't matter because these are Amalek. But there's a genocide going on apparently in South Africa that no one knows of. So when the United States is behaving this way across the board, then countries have to find a mechanism that helps them protect themselves. And I don't know what the Iranian ambassador meant exactly about the future of the relationship between Iran and Russia, and whether it will evolve into some sort of deeper military cooperation than what we see today, how far that will go. But in any case, I think it's understandable that such things are being explored.
When it comes, Professor Marandi, to the foreign policy of Iran, we've had the foreign minister of Iran talking about the situation with the deal with the negotiations with the United States. Do you think that today Iran, how does Iran see the negotiations if the United States if the United States decides to be honest in the negotiations with Iranians, because we had the foreign minister of Iran saying that the United States try to force what they want. How do you see the position of Iranians today, the Iranian official policy toward the negotiations with the United States?
Iran has no reason to negotiate with the United States right now, and it has no intention to negotiate. That doesn't mean that that Iran is opposed to negotiations per se. Iran, even when it knew that the negotiations will lead to nowhere, ultimately accepted indirect negotiations so that they could show both Iranian public opinion and the international community that the United States was insincere. They did that both during the weeks before the war, the 12-day war that was imposed upon the Iranian people, and they also did it after the war, not with the United States, but in their negotiations with the International Atomic Energy Agency in Cairo. And Iran signed an agreement with them because the Europeans promised them that if they did, they would find a solution for the nuclear standoff. The Iranians knew the Europeans were lying, and they were proven correct. So those were smart moves. But right now, there's really nothing to say because the conditions that the United States wants to impose on Iran are ridiculous, and no one in Iran is going to take them seriously. And Iranian society is different today than it was before. No one thinks that anything useful will come out of negotiations with Trump. People are watching Trump on a daily basis, his daily rants, his rage against his internal opponents and his external opponents, his shifts and changes. No one takes him seriously. They see him as a threat. And that is why, probably, if the Iranian military relationship with Russia were to deepen further, there would be much less pushback in Iran today among liberals than there would have been a few months ago. The Americans have really, and the Israeli regime have really made uh, uh, things more difficult for themselves. They have united Iranians in a way in which I haven't seen, as I said once on your show before, since I haven't since that for decades, uh, because of their own foolish behavior. So at the moment, I don't see any sign of negotiations taking place between the two sides because the United States is making outrageous demands.
When the United States decides not to go to war, their war would change to another form of conflict, which is sanctions. I would argue when you look at the history of the revolution in Iran and what has happened in the aftermath of revolution, the huge sanctions in Iran. What Iran has today that the United States wants to limit, to put limits on them, is the nuclear program of Iran and the missile system of Iran. Both of them are the production of sanctions without putting a lot of sanctions on Iran, because we know that before the revolution in Iran you know we had a regime in Iran which was supported by the West and was militarized by the West. Everything in Iran was from the West, but today's Iran is totally independent from the West. They're producing everything they need in terms of to defend themselves. And how do you find it? They continue with this concept of sanctions. How do you see, any, is there any rational thinking behind these sort of sanctions that they're still advocating for?
Well, I think the logic behind the sanctions is to carry out warfare without actually bombing a country. And the West is used to warfare. They bomb countries, they destroy countries. They've been brutal. Look at Cuba. Cuba has been brutalized since before I was born. Does it pose a threat to the United States? I mean, the Cold War period and the Cuban Missile Crisis aside, has Cuba been any form of threat to the United States? But the United States is hell bent on making people there as miserable as possible, for them to die of disease and people to lose their jobs, for families to break up out of poverty. That's the intention of the United States. They want the fabric of society in Cuba to collapse so that they could bring about regime change and bring a regime to their own into power to their own liking. The same is true today in Venezuela. The sanctions against Venezuela are targeted have targeted ordinary Venezuelans. I've been to Venezuela multiple times. It's not even like Cuba. I mean, it's not communist. It's actually Catholic society. I think 70%, maybe 75% of Venezuelans are Catholic. Overwhelmingly, anyway, Christian. Almost 100% Christian. So, so it's not about communism. You have the private sector also in you have very wealthy neighborhoods in Venezuela. So it's not about socialism and communism. It's not about authoritarianism, because the authoritarianism that we see in the Persian Gulf region with these absolute monarchies and across the Arab world, where the Americans have imposed and the Europeans have imposed these dictatorships, uh, that's not a problem. So again, that can't be the reason for their hostility to the Venezuelan people. And of course, the issue of narco terrorism is nonsense, as you've discussed on your show with people with much greater knowledge. It doesn't come from Venezuela. The problems in the United States. But in any case, the United States is aggressive. It tortures people. It destroys lives through sanctions, and that has always been the objective with Iran as well. And there is no doubt that the sanctions have caused great harm. And in recent years, of course, Iran has become more capable of circumventing the sanctions. They've developed their own industrial base and new friendships and alliances and the membership of in BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. All of these have gradually decreased the effect of sanctions, but the effect is still there. But you're right. Before the revolution, the Shah, he was producing 6 million barrels of oil a day. Many part During when the revolution happened, 40 or so percent of Iranians had had an education, were literate. In other words, he was exporting or producing 6 million barrels of oil a day. The population was less than half of what it was today, but the majority of people were literate, and the majority of the literate were women. And this goes. My own experience shows this. After the revolution, when Saddam Hussein invaded Iran, I went to the war front, and it was the cities near the border. Many of them were extremely poor. No running water, no, it was very backward. So, and then again, in my own experience, even though the Shah was like these Arab regimes in the Persian Gulf, the Shah purchased all sorts of weapons, but Iran wasn't producing anything. The weapons that we were using uh, were all imported, and then gradually Iran, because of the sanctions, began to build its own military industry. So the sanctions did make Iran much more self-reliant, much more high tech, much more capable of withstanding the United States. And also, Iran's experiences have been passed on to Russia, for example. When the United States began imposing similar sanctions against Russia after the Ukraine war, many Russian delegations came to Iran to learn about the Iranian experience so that they could rapidly um, overcome many of the problems that were imposed upon them. So the sanctions regime creates hardship, but it also pushes the country to become creative, self-sufficient, self-reliant, and to seek new partnerships. And but most importantly for the West is that it creates a permanent loss because countries like Iran are pushed so far away that they will never come back. The United States, by antagonizing Russia, Iran, and others the way in which it does, it makes any form of rapprochement even more unlikely than ever before. So the United States marginalizes itself.